Good morning. Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page 1338. As I mentioned yesterday, the previous class, that this section in Ayin Beis is essentially based on, and actually almost word for word, on a mimer called the explanation of the mimer Kibiyem Azeh Yechaper, Tov Kuf Samach Beis, which is printed in Likutei Torah, but this is a beer on it, and clearly it's from the Samach Tzedek, and the Rebbe Rashab cites many of the ideas straight from there and elaborates. I just noticed one thing I do want to point out as we summarize what we learned yesterday, which I'll do first, and then I'll point that out. Okay, so what we learned yesterday, we learned in the previous classes, we're talking about now. This began after explaining that the third way of sweetening Gvura, of sweetening the severities, the judgments, the tzimtzumim, the concealments, is not through an outside force, like chesed or sweet waters, but it's from within. That ultimately the ultimate transformation of Gura is from their root. And what's the root? The root is in the Rishimu, which is rooted in the Helema Atzmi. So since it's a koyach nelam, it's a concealed power, means it's detached and it's not revealed. So therefore its impact is from within. It's not an impact from outside. It's within that very entity of the darkness comes the transformation, as we learned, which is essentially the power of tshuva to access that place. So, being that Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman, the 13 attributes of compassion, is essentially the revelation of Yom Kippur, the revelation from that place. So the Rebbe Rashab went into discussion, and this is where begins the beer from the Likutei Torah that I mentioned, Kibiyem Azeh Yechaper, on page 1333 at the bottom, the Pasuk in Kisisa, which introduces the 13 attributes. How did God reveal these 13 attributes? By saying, Hine Mokim Iti, spaces with me. That's the space of the Rishimu that's left after the Tzimtzum. V'nitzavta ala Tzur, and you will stand on the rock. And then he goes on to say, V'nitzavna, I will samticha, and I will place you into the crevice that is chiseled within the rock. All that is the level of Butzina de Kardenissa, that dark or hard flame that's concealed, and sur is just like a flintstone in the example, the root of everything. From there comes the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman. That's the punchline. Obviously, built it up into over the pages that went from page 1334 to where we are up to now, and that's why we say the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman comes from Gvura. Seemingly, like you asked the question, why is it then called Rachamim when it's coming from Tzimtzumim and Cyrus? Because from the Gvuras of Atik come into Malchus Timah, into the superconscious, as we learned yesterday, that from Atik it goes into Malchus Timah, Gvura de Atik into Malchus Timah. From there, it channels into the 13 strands of the beard, which is the Cyrus, into the Yud Gimel Sarachim. But now we understand that this is coming from Tagbeirus Ha'atzmis. It's not coming from Gvura as in limitation, but actually from intensity, from power. Gvura as in strength, a tremendous strength to pierce through and bring down such a high level of the Yud Gimel Midas HaRachman, all the way to a place of sins, which goes against the very plan of God's structure, like we learned. So in order to be able to transform that, you need the Gvuras Da'atik. It's not enough chesed. As he explained at the bottom of 1337, which is also a state of anova, tremendous humility, because to be, he called it anova g'deilev atzuma l'hashpelas v'lamata mata, tremendous humility and tremendous so-called tolerance, to come down to a place a place of the mokam avenis, a place of sins, and to elevate it and to transform it. All this comes from Gvura of Atik that comes into Malchus Timah. Okay. So it has now both elements to it. So why is it Cyrus? Because at the end of the day, this type of slicha mechila, this neise oven, this forgiveness and transforming of sins is tailored, like he said. That it is focused and directed toward the individuals, and therefore it's not just a blanket makiv dika power, a transcendent power for Yud Gimel Samachim, that becomes into midas harach mides from the word medida, but it's a medida atzmis. That's the key here. It's not the measure that we usually talk about, a regular measure thing. It's coming from medida atzmis. In other words, from the sheer power and force of Gvuras Da'atik, is forcing and creating a structure. It's forcing itself into a structure, and that he called the medida atzmis. Yeah, and every chelik of it has the gili at atzmis and is really lamaylim b'chinas midah. Okay, before I sum up the last thing we learned and then continue, so I wanted to just point out. So we've been talking about the Rishimu, excuse me, and also the parentheses at the bottom of page 1336, where the Rebbe Rashab explains the difference between Chesed and Gvura, or the difference between a Medida Mamish, like he says there, where he talks about the difference between Eiris and Kalim, that the Eiris ultimately is an expression of the expansion, the revelation, the very expression of the divine, and that has some definition. Whereas the Gvuras, the Kalim, come from Atzmus Ein Sof, like we learned earlier, from the power to conceal, which he calls does not have definition. Medida Zeis, the first one is a Medida Tzimtzum Miyat, because it's a reflection, it's Oyer, what he called Medida Chutz LeEtzem HaMahus, and I discussed it, I'm not going to go over it again right now, but Etzem HaOyer, Kolshkein Atzmus Ein Sof, Ein B'chinas Medida. So Medida Atzmis, as we discussed at length. And he said that we can explain it in two ways. The Medida is Mitzad Etzem, so it's the very intensity and force and power, core power that comes into a multitude, as we learned before. In other words, it's the sheer force that divides it into details, but it's not really details as in limited structure. Oisha Atzmus Meided Atzmi, or Atzmus measures himself, so to speak, Kavyachol, to come into, it should be contained in a particular form. It should be contained in an internal way, I should say. Okay. But in each one, it's Shleimus Atzmus, it's all a Atzmisdike thing. So as I was reading the source for this, meaning the mimer that where this is based on, so it's an interesting piece. I just want to read a few lines from there because it could be helpful here. He speaks about the Arba Zare, Arba Yitzchak. This everything we're discussing here, where Gvura is more powerful than Chesed. And then he says like this, like the difference between animals and cattle, more intensity, more power. Wherever there's more Gvura, there's more strength, more intensity, and blood, and so on. So, and that the flow from Chesed has a limit, does ultimately cease, where the flow from Gevura is intense and is incessant and continues flowing endlessly because of its intensity. So he says on that the following. So I want to refer to a line. Where's this line where I want to, let me see here. So there was a line earlier, just to give me a minute. I want to just find it, 1 second. I don't find it right now. The line I'm looking for, where he said that, yeah, I think. That you have to say that by Gvura, even in its source, it's already measured in a certain way. And by Gvura, in its source, it's unlimited. I'm trying to find where that is. Either on page 1335 or 1336. Because that's the line that I wanted to analyze a bit more. Oh, here we are. Okay, in the middle of page 1336, he says this line. He says, on the line that begins with B'chinas Bli Gvul, he says, and being that we see that through Gvura, it causes an intense or a increased, a multitude of ashpa, b'ribui dafke. That's what Gvura does. It creates a massive flow, b'ribui, in many, many details. You have to say that Gvura has this from its original source. It's in its original source, it has that intensity, that power, that force. That means in its source, Gvura is coming from something that is endless and unlimited. By contrast, chsadim nimdu gambim kedam. Already in their source, it's not just in their flow, in their extension, but in their source. Their nibdu b'chinas mida lechein yichla shifam, and that's why their shefa, their flow, will cease, because that's what its role is. Its role is ultimately a form of expression. Gvura's role is to bring something that is beyond expression, beyond structure. So the Tzemach Tzedek writes the following. He says like this. These words are, the Mamish writes like this. It goes like, I'm sorry. Okay, being that by Gvura Shifam, its flow, Ein Kates, Liribui, to its multitude, to its multitudes. Literally, the words that he's saying here is taken straight from here. You have to say that that's how they are in their Beker Chetzim when they were first chiseled, when they were first shaped and formed in their source. Before they extended, Sheshamu Blekates V'Gvul Mamish. Literally the same words. There's no limit to them and there's no parameter. But chsadim are measured and also in their source with a measure. There's a definition. God wants to express. That alone is already a definition. That's why their shefa will cease. So the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek writes, being that this is a maimer from the Alter Rebbe. Now the Alter Rebbe did not write his own maimerim in most cases. He wrote Tanya and he wrote something, but he didn't write the maimerim. They were written by different manichim, by different writers. What the main one was his brother Mariel, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, but the Mittler Rebbe also wrote many of the maimerim, and many of them we have. So the Tzemach Tzedek is looking at a hanocha of this maimer in Tovkuf Samach Beis from the Mittler Rebbe, and there's things the Mittler Rebbe adds that are not there from the original, from the Alter Rebbe. So this is what he says here. He says this addition, that you have to say that in their source, Gvura and Chesed are different. Gvura has no limit, and Chesed has a limit. He says, Zeu divrei Meiri v'chamizal. These are the words of my father, of my Meiri, my teacher, my father-in-law, which is the Mittler Rebbe. The Mittler Rebbe was both the uncle and father-in-law of the Tzemach Tzedek. So he says, this is his words. So in other words, we know now that this was added by the Mittler Rebbe. And then he goes on to explain the Tzemach Tzedek, the Ef Shalemer, or Ef Shalafar. We can explain it according to what it says in Vayikach Kerach, the Maimer Vayikach Kerach and Lukutei Torah, that the root of Chsadim is from the Kav Chut. The Kav, Chsadim comes from the Kav, the ray of light, the thin ray and thread of light. V'sheirish HaGvuras ma'er ein sof shenistalik mimkeim haponi ba'atzmus shehu lamayla ma'akav. And Gvuras is rooted in the Eir Ein Sof that was removed, was concealed from the Mokim Pani, from the empty space, into Atzmus, into the core. That's higher than the Kav. And that's why Losad Lavi, the Levim, will be Kohanim. That Gvuras will go higher than Chesed. But the point here is, it's literally what we're learning here. So you could see, just based on that line, this addition of the Mittler Rebbe, explained by the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Rashab turned it into a whole subject. That this is, the Atmos is the Helam Atzmi, but that's the root of the Rishimu, which is what remains in this Mokim Pani. Like he said, the Mokim Pani is empty, but it's not completely empty. There's a Rishimu there. So though he doesn't mention the word Rishimu here, but it's very clear that it's the same level, that's higher than the Kav. As we've been learning, Ur is higher than Kalim. So when you read now the parentheses, Yesh Lemesh Uzel Al Derech Shen is Bar L'il, that Eris are higher than Kalim, that Kalim are higher, the root of the Kalim are higher than the root of the Eris. When you look at the source, you see it come together and how it all developed. Just wanted to point that out. But with that said, I'm going to go back to 1338, conclude the summary of what we learned, and then continue, try to finish till the end of the paragraph at least, if not more. So now, so in the third line on page 1338, I summed it up. Now he goes back to the Tzur. Let's go back to the rock where Moshe was placed as the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim were being revealed to him. And here's the Alter Rebbe's innovative and fascinating explanation, because it's based on Alter Rebbe's Maimorim, as I said. Kibiyem Azeh Yechaper and Kutet Terach said in the year Tovkuf Samak Beis, and its explanation. So now we'll understand the Tzur. The Tzur is the level of Butzina de Kardenissa. As we learned, the Tzur is like Tzura Chalomish, is the source of fire, but it's not fire itself. The sparks come from there, but like he said, it's B'koyach v'lei b'poil. Back on page 1334. B'koyach v'lei b'poil. Butzina de Kardenissa. As we said, either Butzina means a flame or a spark. Kardenissa could either be hard, like a rock, or concealed, dark. And what level is that? The level we've been learning. Gvuras of Atik, that manifest in Malchus Tema. From there originate the Yud Gimel Midas Harachim, Yud Gimel Tikunei Dikra. The Hirele Esim, and this is where the Eibishter showed this, these Yud Gimel Harachim, he showed, where did he show it to him? He hid, he concealed Moshe's neshama. Benikras Tzur. So this is the spiritual dimension of it all. That Moshe is placed Benikras in the crevice in the rock. That means Moshe is being, God is revealing to him the Yud Gimel Samrachim of where they're originating from. That's the meaning of the rock, the crevice in the rock. Like we said yesterday from Yeshaya, where he brings Pnimishu Nelim is Galus B'chin Shorshe Avoyes or Pirish Nikrasu Meloshin Ilmakeves Ber Nakartam. That is talking about the crevice in the rock or the hole in the ground from where you originated. And that's referring to the womb of Sarah, from which gives birth. Birth comes from. So now all this is also from the Maimer. And literally this not, I first thought the Rebbe Rashab was saying all this. It's literally from the Maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek. And he connects and says, so from this we know that it's Yesod of Nukva. According to the Pardes, we learned that Tzur is Binah. So it's the Yesod of Binah. And according to what we're learning here, it's Gvuras of Atik. So he says it's Yesod of Malchus of Ein Sof, as the Zohar HaRakiya says, that was quoted earlier. So in all cases, it's a level of Yesod. The question is it Malchus like the Rechem, the womb, Sarah? Is it the Yesod in Binah? Or is it the Yesod in Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum, which is where Butzina de Kardenissa, which is really what is relevant to us is the third meaning. But he's going to reconcile it with the other two. First of all, Yesod of Malchus is connected to Yesod of Malchus of Ein Sof. So that's connected in that sense. But what's the connection to Binah? That's what we're going to learn now. That's where we stopped. So the bottom line is that we're talking here about the level of B'tzin D'Kadishim. So Zeh B'chinas HaReshimu Shenishra Achar HaTzimtzum V'im Kein B'chinas Gvura Da'atik. That's the last line we learned. Who B'chinas HaReshimu Gvura Savatik come from the Reshimu, originating in Yesod Malchus of Ein Sof. Or that is the which is the Zehu B'nizbar L'Zel B'chinas Tzur B'Sharshe. That's the level of Tzur B'Sharshe, as we explained earlier on page 1334. Yeah, Tzur. One second. So, like we learned that the Reshimu, everything that will come afterwards in Ishtalshlus all originate from the Reshimu. However, it's in a concealed and concentrated form. Yeah. We learned that on page 1332, that everything comes from the Reshimu.
The Tzur is the Butzina de Cardenisa.
Excuse me?
The Tzur you just mentioned is the Butzina de Cardenisa.
They're all the same level. Butzina de Cardenisa is Gvura of Atik, that manifests in Malchus Tema. That, he says, is the level of, that's Gvura, that he says that clear, Butzina de Cardenisa. That's the same level as the Reshimu. Yeah. So it's all, that's the level. Tzur, Butzina de Cardenisa, Reshimu, Gvuras de Atik are all associated with each other.
Is Malchus the Ein Sof a part of the Helem Ha'atzmi, or it's much lower? It's in the level of the Shimu.
My understanding, just 1 second, let me just see one thing here. If you look on top of page 1330, when he brings the Zeir Arakia, when he first explained Avir Kadmin and Oyer Kadmin, he said that the Avir Kadmin is the first Keli. He called it a Keli, and that's the level of the Reshimu. So it sounds like this to me. Before the Tzimtzum, remember, Reshimu by definition means an impression from something that was there before. So there's no Reshimu really before the Tzimtzum. It's rooted before the Tzimtzum. It's what's left over after the Tzimtzum. The Reshimu is what's left over, and the Tzimtzum didn't affect it. It's like like I said, like a capsule that captures everything that was there before the Tzimtzum. So where is it rooted, the Reshimu, for the Oisius of Goliv Galifu B'Tehirei Law? The Oisius that are engraved in the level of Shir Atzmei B'Keach, when God envisions. So that's where you have Oisius, and that he calls a Keli. If you look on top of page 1330, he said, Peter's clay kibble. Goliv Galifu, muscle on a cloud. And he says, that's the Pirush of Butzina de Cardenisa, that Tzimtzum HaYesod the Malchus, Hanelemes Be'en Sof, who Nikra Butzina de Cardenisa. Pirush Butzina, Ner Lotzuk B'Tzeichet Shem and Tev. So basically it goes like this. Helema Atzmi is higher than everything. There's no yet. Helema Atzmi is the root of all of this. The power, like we say, God's capacity not to reveal. Or Helema Atzmi, a fundamental state of concealment. Then there's the level of Oyer. In the Oyer, there's going to be Oyer is Gilui. There's Gilui La'atzmei. There's Etzema Oyer. There's Gilui La'atzmei, he reveals to himself. Ola B'Sene, where it begins to arise in his desire. That then in turn comes into a rotzen for existence. But now, what's happening? The will for existence requires that God break it into details. Like we learned yesterday, the 10 hidden spheres, which is these Eiris, the Eiris, or not Kalim, but like the so-called conceptual Eiris and Kalim, or if you wish, Oisius, before the Tzimtzum, that's rooted in Gvuras and Gvura. Of Atik, you can say Atik before the Tzimtzum, of Atik of the 10 hidden spheres, but really from the Helem Atzmi, because the place of creating structure, we learned, the Medida Atzmis has to come from Atzmus, from Koyach Atzmus, from the Helam Atzmi. Oyer doesn't have the power to create such a medid. Oyer has its own measure, but to create the medida that we need here needs Gvura Da'atik. That's what we learned. So basically, the Helam Atzmi is the power to create structure, but a medida atzmis. It's not structure as an oyer, which creates an actual medida. And this I explained the number of last few classes. That will ultimately translate into what we're calling Yesod of Malchus, Hanalemes Bein Seif, which means in the 10 hidden spheres, the lowest one is Malchus. Now, after that comes the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum conceals the oyer, and what remains? The Rishimu remains the Yesod of Malchus of the 10 hidden spheres, plus the whole 10 hidden spheres, plus all the Oiris that we spoke about. Remember, the Rishimu contains encapsulated also the Oir that was revealed for others, the Oir to himself. It's just not in the form of Oir. It's all within the Rishimu. The Kav will then draw from there. Now, if you need more explanation, I can go over it, but I did explain it quite a few times, how this works. So essentially, the Rishimu is the conduit that brings together all these deeper levels. Oyer reveals it. But the Rishimu has also, as we learned, two things. The Etzem Nekudus Rishimu, and that's completely Helam. That's like Helam from Helam Atzmi. And then there's the Avir, the Yud, in the Rishimu. And we learned that that's the Oyer that's concealed within the Rishimu. That's the second thing. That is connected more to Gilui, as we learned. That's more like the second level of transforming the bitterness or the Gvura to sweetness. This we learned earlier as well. That's the Yud HaKol Ba'avir. Yeah. Now, if you need me to go over this again, I have no problem with doing that because it is complicated. But that's ultimately what we're discussing here. So the Rishimu is after the Tzimtzum, but it is not being affected by the Tzimtzum. It encapsulates in a concealed form these levels that I described. Even the Oyer is in it in a concealed way. The Kav will actually start revealing it in a conscious and expressed way that we can identify with. Because in the Rishimu alone, we could not in any way access it. It's like all concentrated in a seed.
But the essence spheres Gnusis are part of the Oyer Shekoidem Tzimtzum, right? Before the
like all Esser spheres, it has Oyer and Keli. Depends what you're talking about. If you're talking about the component of the Oyer HaGvul, which is like the Oyer, the energy of Chochmah and Binah, that's the Oyer of the Esser spheres Gnusis. If you're talking about the Oisius, the structure of the Esser spheres Gnusis, what distinguishes Chochmah and Binah, that comes from Gvuras of Atik. Whereas the Oyer comes from the Chesed of Atik. So it depends whether you're talking about the structure or you're talking about the divine energy within it.
But
So
this
really
is
has
like,
both.
today's Tanya said talks about Osius Elyon. Is this the Osius that is talking about today? In today's Tanya, the same thing, Osius Elyon, which is does have all the creation. Is that what we're talking about now?
I don't know. I don't want to connect it to anything that's not an Ayin Beis because this is confusing enough. So I'd have to look inside Tanya and see if it's connected. May or may not be.
Is Gvuras Atik part of the Esser spheres Gnusis or part of the Helam Atzmi?
Helam Atzmi is before there's spheres, before there's anything. I'm not sure why I can't get it across to you. There's Yecholte Lahoy, Yecholte. There's no Oyer, and there's no Rotzen even. In Helam Atzmi, there's no spheres altogether. It's beyond everything. It's called Helam Atzmi, fundamental concealment. It's the mocker from which will come the Rishimu and the Sheirish HaKelim and the Sheirish HaEsis. That's the power that will create it. But the Helam Atzmi itself is not any of these levels. It's higher than everything.
That means that Gvuras Atik is part of the Rishimu.
He says here, Gvura Atik is the Rishimu. He says here, Bechinas Gvura Atik hu mebechinas haRishimu. Gvura Atik is from the Rishimu. That's what he says here. Okay, you see? essentially you have to see, look, it's getting now mechanical again, and mechanics to me always are very problematic because we're dealing here with levels that are not defined even. It's purely abstract, but essentially you have to find an example in your own life, something that you can hold on to, or else this is going to remain very elusive and you'll never really get it. So the example I keep giving is the artist. The artist, before he creates any art, he envisions things. He can envision, before he's even being an artist, he has the power to become an artist, but he also has the power to create structure. These are powers within him that are not yet anything. There's no art, there's no canvas, there's nothing. It's all within him. The power to conceal, the power to reveal. That's Helam Atzmi and Koyach Ha'er, and that's Ma'er. So Oir and the Oir and Helam and Gilui, or Oir and Cheshach, whatever you want to call it. This is a powers. These powers will manifest within him as he begins to choose to want to create art, a world. He needs two things. He needs definitions, he needs a structure, but he also needs ideas. He also needs energy. He needs an oir, because without oir, kelim and structure don't have a message. They don't have they're not conveying anything. It's like letters on a page without messages. So the message is the oir. The kelim is the structure. So usually we think of oir as being superior to kelim, and they are. But in truth, the root of kelim, the root of being able to create structure, requires something that oir itself cannot give it, and that is the intensity and the strength and power that Gvura creates the Ischalkus that we need. If you go back to what we learned, why is Gvura necessary? Firstly, to make sure the flow goes all the way downward. So you need that intensity. You can't just have, for example, let's say you had water running, but you have no pressure, or blood without blood pressure, God forbid. So Gvura creates pressure. It pushes it forward. That is rooted all the way in the Helam Atzmi, has that, his Gabrus Atzmis. The second thing is it divides things. It breaks it into details. Chesed is one flow. Gvura breaks things into details. But how do you explain breaking into details with the same idea that's coming from Tagberis Atzmis? That's why he says the details are not details. They're Medida Atzmis. They're just details in the context that the Poel Manish, it breaks into details, but it's not coming from concealment, it's coming from intensity. That when you push something very hard, it breaks into many parts. Like if you throw something from very far, it's going to break into a lot more parts than when you throw it from close. Or when you, like I said, you hit an anvil and you strike something very hard, sparks will fly everywhere. If it doesn't have Gvura, it won't fly, it won't be so many sparks. So that's what he's explaining. So in order for there to be Eses Sfiras Hagnuzis, if you go back to what we learned yesterday, the day before, he said clearly, for there to be the Ischalkus. He says, so this is all originating from the power of Helam Atzmi, that the artist has within him a power called Helam. He has a power called Gilui. Then as it moves toward him now envisioning existence, he needs both. The Reshimu will also have both. It has both the Helam part, the actual Oisius Arishimu, the Etzem Nekudus Arishimu, that's Helam Atzmi. It also has in it a Reshim of everything. That was in Gilui. Then comes the Kav, which is rooted in Oyer, and that's like the paintbrush that begins painting, but you have all these ingredients and dynamics already in place to be able to create existence. So the Rebbe Rashab is giving us a peek behind the scenes, what's happening in the root of all of it, how it's all ultimately evolving. So when we look at a world like ours, and you see a beautiful world, a piece of art, it has two things going on. There's the structure of existence, Deimim, Tzemeya, Chai, Medaber. A person has Ramach Evarim. We have a heart, a brain. We have arms, legs, ears, eyes, nose, liver, lungs. That's structure. But they also have function. They have a function. The eyes see, the ears hear, the heart beats, the heart is emotions. The mind, the brain has intelligence. So it has a oiris and kalim. But now we understand where they're rooted, so we can understand that when we ultimately connect to godly, to the divine source, the oiris connect us to one side of things, the kalim to another, and you go deeper and deeper, the kalim have something that the oir doesn't have. But as I said, the Eir has things that the Keli doesn't have, like a neshama and a guf. So you have to find examples within ourselves and then go back to see how it's in its source. The language that's being used here is Kabbalistic terminology for these levels. So it's just a name. It could throw you until you really understand, because Butzina de Cardenis is a very cryptic term. What does it mean? It means a dark spark or a hard spark. What does that mean? But when you understand the context here, and then you look at the posuk, and it says Nikras Tzur, that he placed them in the crevice in the rock. He concealed them. A crevice is like a hole in the rock. What is the rock? Tzur is this level of Gurus of Atik, and that's what Moshe Rabbeinu was experiencing. And then from there originated Yud Gimel Tzarachim, which also require Gurus of Atik, the Nikras Tzur. That's why he placed them there, to be able to reveal this deeper level of compassion that has the power to go all the way down and forgive even sins and transform them. And that which is also a power of Gurus of Atik that go through Moiches Tema to the Yud Gimel Midas Arachim. So
and that's called a choirai, right? This is a choirai. The roisa is a choirai.
We didn't get to that yet. We didn't discuss that yet. He doesn't say that. I spoke about it, but which one is achera? We don't know. What's panai? What's achera? He didn't explain what level that is.
The Nikras Tzur. What you said for the Ponem Yafos.
I said it, but the Rebbe Rashab didn't say it, so I don't know what level that is yet. Let's see where he goes. I know in the Maimim B'Yem Hazeh Yechaper he does talk about it, but I would. But later, it's going to get. He didn't finish the psukim. The next paragraph he continues on to explain what is ba'avur kveidi v'samticha. You have to still explain what means when the covet passes by. He's going to explain that part of the pasuk next. But we still have to finish the tzur discussion here. So the next piece, okay, I hope that helped clarify some things. Are there any other questions?
I just have a quick question to kind of summarize this. So we're talking about Hamtakas Hagvurus from within itself.
You're asking a question, or you just want to tell me the summary and see if you're correct?
Well, maybe it's a little of both, but there is a question there.
Okay.
So we're talking about Hamtakas Hagvurus from within itself, and it turns out that the source of the Hamtakas of Gurus is mamish. It is Gurus. It's the Tagbur. It's the Tagburus coming from the highest level, and the explanation is that in order to have the sweetening of the Gurus, or to have the transformation of the Zonos to Zachios, it has to come from such a high level. Because it's going down to such a low level, it has to come from a very high level that can reach those lowest levels. And furthermore, it's the high level from which things are created originally. And so if you're going to get a clean slate, you sort of ultimately have to return to the place from which you originally came, in a sense, if you're going to sort of have a new lease on life, if you will, from that moment of sin. So it has to come from a very high place from which it rises above, essentially, I guess, the judgment, I guess. It rises above the dinim, so that that's why it's coming from such a high place. And that high place turns out to be Gvura, because it's such a long distance. It's coming from such a high source that it requires that energy in order to bring it down to that lowest level of zonas, if you will. Is that correct?
More or less, generally. I mean, there's some things that are not exact, but essentially, but I would refer you back to page 1332 and 1333, where he says, the Rebbe Rashab explicitly talks about this, where he talks exactly why you need this highest level to transform. But overall, it sounds pretty right.
Okay.
But there's more to it. But I would just go back and make sure that how you understand it is consistent with the language. So you look at the end of the paragraph on page 1333, where he talks about it very, very explicitly. I'm talking Hagimel.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Thank you.
So now we still have to contend with the Pardes Pirish of Tzur. So this is going to be a little dense here, but this is referring to something that I need to explain. Ibbur Rishon and Ibbur Sheini. He's going to explain like this. I'll read it inside, then I'll explain. Okay, so so the last line I read, that's the level of tzur, and its root is the rishim. Okay. Gvura avatik. Just to sum it up again, generally speaking, we speak Gvura of Atik, we mean Atik of Atzilus, like he spoke about in the previous page. But there's also Gvura of Atik as it's rooted in the Atik that's even higher than Ak. Now we know it's rooted in the Rishimu. And I would go a step further, it's rooted in the Gvura of Atik of the 10 hidden spheres, which ultimately is rooted in the Helama Atzmi. Just wanted to throw that in. He doesn't say this explicitly, but when you put it all together, it sounds very much that's what this, how it works. And same thing with Malchus. Remember, Malchus of Atzilus is rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, but it's again microcosm, macrocosm. So you can make those comparisons, but they're ultimately two different levels. But there's a connection there. So now he continues like this.
The 10 Esser spheres are before the Tzimtzum, right? Esser spheres are before the Tzimtzum.
It depends which opinion. According to the Arizal, it's Atik. According to Chassidus, brings that it's also in before the Tzimtzum. But regardless, it's higher than the Esser spheres Hagluyas of Atzilus. Not a contradiction, different levels. It depends what level you're talking. Remember, if you're talking about it in the deepest levels, Chassidus explains it's before the Tzimtzum. Yeah. It's the Shir Atzmei B'Keyach Golif Galifu B'Tirei Law. But there are explanations that explain it after the Tzimtzum too. But it's relative. It's all relative. Okay. So the truth is, this should have been read yesterday, and from continuing what we left. He's now saying somewhere else it explains that the general Rishimu is also a level of Tigberis Ha'atzmus, due to the intensity, the very power and force of Atzmus. I'm not sure where that Mokemacher is. It could be it's connected to the Rebbe Marash's Mamorim and the Rebbe Rashab's explanations, where the Rishimu Loinogaba at Tzimtzum. If the Rishimu captures the Koyach HaGvul of Ein Sof, which is what essentially it is, like he said earlier, the Etzem Nekudas HaRishimu, is Koyach HaGvul Shebein Shezeh Shu B'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi, so that clearly Tagberis, because it means the Rishimu is capturing Oyer is Chesed, is coming from Chesed, and this is Tagberis Ha'atzmi. So that's what he's adding now, which only makes closer the connection between Rishimu and Gvuras of Atik, Tagberis Ha'atzmus. Well, the Fimashin is Boyer, Shezeh B'chinas Yesod Binah. Remember, we said a few lines before, the Pardes said that Tzur is Binah. So according to that, Nikras HaTzur, the crevice chiseled within the rock where Moshe stood is Yesod of Binah, of Ima. So now he's going to connect that to what we just learned. He says, Harizeh b'chinas Ibbur Sheini d'Zah b'Yesod d'Ima. That's the level of Ibbur Sheini of Zah, the Yesod Ima, which happens in the Yesod of Ima. V'nizbar le'el the Zeh b'chinas b'chol ma'adecha. I don't know if you remember this, but a while back, let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah. Ibbur Sheini was a whole discussion on page, on the left side, page, I think 12. I thought I'd find it quicker. It's probably even earlier. Oh yeah, page 1243. So let me explain what Ibbur Sheini is, and you'll see how he's it's obviously a Kabbalistic piece, but I'll show you how he explains it. 1 second. Okay.
We're in 1243, first of all, before you start. Please.
A line around 10 lines from the top. So let me explain what he says there. You could follow. I'll show you a few lines that he addresses it. If you may recall, the process of how God creates is very similar to what we recognize as being birthing, a birthing. So when a child is conceived, so there's a Ibbur, there's a pregnancy, a gestation period of 9 months, where the child develops in the mother's womb. What is that in Avodah? That's the mother is Ima, is Binah. Chachma is the father, Abba. Chachma provides the seed, right, the tipa. Ima provides the egg and the womb. And it's in the Yesod of Ima, in the womb of Binah, where the midas, Zoh, are developing. And ultimately, the Hisbonenus of Chachma and Binah, father and mother, give birth to the midas of emotions that recognize and connect to godliness. Essentially means when you contemplate, it gives birth, like he explains in chapter 3 in Tanya. Now, what's Chachma, Binah, and Das? Chachma is the father, Binah is the understanding, the comprehension. Das is the iskashrus. And for there to be birth of a midah, you need the father, the mother, and their union, their iskashrus, v'adam yada eschava, and that gives birth to midas. We're not talking about natural midas that we're born, that we all have our natural instincts or our natural impulses. We're talking about midas that are born through his bonus. And that was a big part of our discussion because we are born we're born self-contained human beings. Our subjective interests and self-interest is what drives us. But as we grow, we develop, our minds teach our hearts to begin to think about something more than you. There's something to existence beyond your survival and your needs, and that is others and God. So essentially, the process of pregnancy is the maturing process of the midas developing from infancy, from the early stages of pregnancy to the point they become full-blown midas. That's stage 1. But then Kabbalah explains we want the midas to grow even more than that. We don't just want the midas to say, okay, you know what? I recognize there's a God. I recognize God provides for me, sustains me. I know that I can't just be completely me. I need to be devoted and dedicated. So yes, it's Ava V'yira, but it's Ava Yira Sichlim, it's called. Because it's based on Seichel, on his bonus. You contemplated, Chachma and Binah contemplated and gave birth to these midas. That's called Ibbur Rishon. But the next stage of maturity, which is also called pregnancy, but it's not an actual pregnancy, obviously, in real life, because we only spend 9 months in our mother's womb once. But in Ruchnius, when a person grows, their mind takes them now, the midas now have matured to the point that they catapult. Like we said, Shalach to Shalach Hasa'im, that the midas, which are like the fledglings, the Efrechim, the chicks, the midas that are born, have matured enough that they don't need their mother sitting on them anymore. They don't need Binah guiding them anymore, because now they've been born and they've already developed. But not only don't they actually elevate to a point where they go back to Binah, to the mother, and they join her in an Ibbur Sheini, where now you're going from midas sichlim to midas that are higher than Ma'ila Matam V'das. What he said before, actually, I should correct myself. This is midas. The midas now begin to assume a personality of the mother in the sense of also Binah as it is separate from being a mother to children. HaChochma and Bina gaze at and are connected to Arich and Atik that are higher than Ishtalshlus. Till now, we were talking about a mother and a father, but especially a mother focusing on her middays to train them to grow from babies, from infancy into adults. But now, as adults, these midas join the mother, and now they all elevate to experience the super consciousness of what? Atik and Arich. Yes, Yud Gimel Tikkun Dikna, like he even mentions on that page, I believe. Cyrus of Arich. So if you look there, this is directly connected to this. So he's saying like this now, that according to the Pardes, that the Nikras Tzur is Yesod of Ima, he says that we can explain that's consistent because it's the second elevation of Ibbur Sheini. I'll read inside on page 1243. It may be easier to understand. So he says, the midas cause an aliyah and an elevation of B'chinas Bina, but I'm reading 7 lines from the top of 1243. It's not Bina coming down, it's the midas going up. Is the Ibbur of Zah midas in the beten, in the womb, or the belly of Ima, like it says in Eitz Chaim, the B'chdeshiyam Shochas Meichen the Gadlus B'Zah. We want now Meichen the Gadlus, not just Meichen the Meichen as it was associated with emotions, but the Meichen the Gadlus, Meichen as they are on their own. So that Tzorich is Ibbur Sheini the Zah. Zah has to go through now a second form of gestation to get to that place. And this second stage of gestation or pregnancy is that the midas are now higher than tam v'das, as opposed to Ibburish, the Kamosha Ibburishin who shamidas and lamatam adas, just like in the first Ibbur. They're lamatam adas rak b'chinas tivim. They're just the natural, the behavioral, instinctive emotions. The hainurak mitzadat v'asha benefesh. That's only due to the way the nefesh is wired. I'm just skipping, but they're betachlis hakatnus. They're ultimately in an immature because they're still not fully developed in Ibbur Rishon. I just want to see. I want to just skip. Right. Kamoy came b'chinas Ibbur Sheini who gam ken lo yal piatam ki mitzad ashrosha shebenefesh. So also Ibbur Sheini is also now on a very high, but it's on a far higher level. That's what he's referring. So we're not talking about an ava that comes al piseichel like b'chol avavcha b'chol nafshecha, but ava b'chol meidecha she ava habilti mugbelas. That's a love that's unlimited, and bittul mitzias, complete transformation of the person. Literally, what we've been learning about total transformation once you reach that higher level. That's all I wanted to read right now. So what he's going is connecting it to that, and he's saying like this. The nukve who b'chinas iskashrus lekabel liklitus hashefu b'chinas klei reiken machzik. So in other words, the first state of bittul is the first state of Ibbur is Yesod of Malchus in Sarah, what he called Nikras Tzur, the womb, but it's on a lower level. It's the first Ibbur, and that's his kashrus that Yesod the nukve, the womb, is connecting, attaching to receive and to absorb the flow, the shefa that comes from Zoh. It's an empty container that contains and holds on. And we can say this is the bittul due to the animal soul that becomes a keli to accept the tzur, this level of tzur, of gvura, that comes through tshuva, kameshis bar b'samuch, like he explains shortly. Okay, and then he takes us in the parentheses to look at another mimer. Because of time limits, I'm going to stop here. but we definitely did not clarify this. But I believe we need to go back. We need to go back to the mimer of the Tzemach Tzedek, because he speaks about this, I think, in more detail. And I think to understand this better, we need to read what it says there, and then we'll understand it all. But B'kitzur Nimratz, what he's trying to explain here is that the process of receiving this higher level of Yud Gimel Midas HaRachamim goes through stages. Yesod Malchus, which is what he called Nikas Tzur. Yesod of Ima, Binah, which is when it elevates to the Ibbur Sheini. And then Yesod of Malchus of Ein Sof, which is the Tagberis of Gurus of Atik. And they're all part of the process of this growth. He's just saying it very briefly, but that's essentially the gist of where he's going. But I want to learn it inside in the Tzemach Tzedek before I go back here to learn this here. We'll do that next year.
This level was given to Moshe Rabbeinu when he was put in the crevices in the rock, this Ibbur Sheini.
According to the Pardes, that's the Tzur. So apparently there's that process. Yeah, all these levels seem to be. But that's why I want to go back to the mimer. Tzedek talks about this for sure.
Can you please post that mimer so we can read it with you?
Yeah, if I have a chance, I'll post it.
Okay. It's the mimer you mentioned yesterday, right? You gave me the citation, 1280.
In Dvarim, yeah, but there's also, yeah, correct.
Yeah, I don't have that volume. I couldn't find it online either.
Why is it called Ibbur Sheini? You need the
By the way, I
mother.
didn't say 1280. It's not 1280. It's 2021-28.
Okay.
Why is it-
Well, I don't have it anyways.
It's volume 5, yeah.
Why is it called Ibbur Sheini? Okay, they need the mother, the support of the mother to the higher level.
So I just read from inside the mimer. That's what Kabbalah calls it. It's a second stage of development. What is Ibbur? Ibbur is a development of Midas. It's called a development. That's a development and gestation of the Midas. So there's a first stage. In Eitz Chaim, he says Ibbur Sheini. There's a second stage of this type of pregnancy to give birth to another level of Midas.
Okay.
That's what it's called in Kabbalah.
Yeah, but Chochmah is not involved in Ibbur Sheini.
First of all, Ibbur is pregnancy. Chachma is involved, just for the record. Did you follow what I just read from page? What page did I refer to? 12.
43.
12 what?
43.
Yeah. 1243. Yeah. So he tzeichens there. Look in Eitz Chaim, he says, Shari Ibburim. Yeah. So this is we learned much earlier. I'm not going to go through the whole thing we learned, but it is another process where the Midas now join with Bina, and then ultimately also with Chochmah, as he explained there, to elevate to. It's basically stages of emotional development. We all grow, right? So the growth is basically dividing into two development stages. One is just creating Midas Tivim, that they should be aligned to godliness, and then it comes to reach the Midas should go even higher than the natural. B'chol meidecha. V'ahavta b'chol meidecha. But we'll go over this again. I'm going to read it slowly. We'll go over it in detail.
So these principles are very beautiful, and it explains the process of forgiveness and even maturation and rehabilitation and the source of the Yud Gimel Midas Arachamim, et cetera, But I'm wondering, like the kasha that's difficult is, what about someone who's a simpleton, who they can feel sorry, they can regret what sin that they did, but to suggest that they are capable of contemplating such higher levels of godliness, that in order for them to get real tshuva, to get a real renewal, I mean, isn't it asking a bit much of a simpleton?
Well, I consider myself a simpleton, and yet the Rebbe Rashab gave us Ayin Beis and said, learn it as best as you can. I'm not sure you're asking me if Ayin Beis is for every, I'm not sure what you asked me. If a simpleton could do tshuva or a simpleton could understand these ideas of chassidus. What's your question?
Yeah, whether the simpleton can get the highest form of tshuva. And by the way, you're far from a simpleton. You're about as far from a simpleton as a human being can get, with great respect. And that is really with great respect. So what I'm saying is, if he's explaining here, no, someone doesn't have to learn Ayin Beis, they don't have to study it, they don't have to understand it. But the concepts are true. This is truth. This is the way godliness is
when a person,
structured.
I mean, earlier he said in Ayin Beis that when even lost souls, that he said are completely lost, there's like hopeless almost. They too, there's the Helam Ha'atzmi, the Gvuras within them, the Gvuras Helam Ha'atzmi within them that can awaken them, like the Shefer Gadol or Yom Kippur. So that's Kal Shebekalim is really another word for saying a simpleton. It's just another form of that. So
True.
everybody, Shuva, that power lies within them. We were saying how Gvura carries the energy all the way down to the lowest levels. So number one is everybody has the capacity to connect to God. There's no such thing as someone can't. And the darker it may be, that's getting from Gvuras Avatik, that power. Whether they understand all the dynamics, that's like anything in life. Just because you get your car fixed doesn't mean you know how the mechanic does it. So the same thing here. We don't make, Chassidus teaches us the dynamics, how it happens. But the process, Rabbi Eliezer ben Dadaya just came to the last day of his life and he just cried out in despair. So crying out in pain, or the painly cry, the deathly cry we learned about, is something that everybody, unfortunately, can access. So now, learning about it doesn't necessarily make you easier to do tshuva. Learning about it just teaches you how it works and the science behind it, so to speak.
It's the same thing as the cockle-doodle-doo story, right, Robert Jacobson?
The kukuriku.
Kukuriku, yeah, because the thing is, actually, I think the simpleton, I may even have a better chance, because just like you said yourself, with the mashal of somebody going to the palace, a simpleton versus somebody who knows stuff, we have to also be careful, not just to understand the stuff, but not get caught up in the details, because sometimes you miss the whole point, that the simpleton can reach even better,
Yeah.
Robert Jacobs, I have a question to ask, and I don't know. I know you just said like the example of the artist, just to have something that we could relate to, and I don't know if this applies to understanding this very last concept we spoke about or not. And the concept is this: that when you have a set of parents that obviously have a kid, and the kid, let's say they're not religious, and the kid in today's world, and the kid, grows up and does teshuvah. Also, the kid is able to get the parents to do teshuvah and raise them to a higher level. Would that be a fair kind of a simple, simplistic example of what we're talking about? The very last thing that you talked about.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially that first parents educate children. Their years of education, they need their parents a lot, and then the parents can, once they're adults, the parents take care of them, or I would say not take care of them, because they can build their own lives at that point. But the parents, we're talking about really deeply spiritual parents, can lead them to another level of spiritual experience. Yeah. That's what we learned back then. The difference between like Shiluch HaKan, when the Eim Revetzes ala Frechim, when the mother spreads over and hovers over her chicks, and then there's the stage where Shalach Ha'Eim, the chicks, they send away the mother, meaning that they get elevated to the next level. Yeah.
And then there's a level where the midos raise up the Chacham Binah, so which I think he was talking, maybe mentioning that
that was that's what I just read on that page 12 to 20. Well, first Binah, first it's raising Binah, then he took.
Then the koach of the midos can raise up Chacham Binah.
Then there's the Binah Chachma joined together. Yichud Abba ve'ima Eloyin, if you recall, or Yichud Abba ve'ima Pnimi, Zivug Shlim, a complete union, a deeper level of Zivug and union. That's what we learned at length there. This was at length. This was not a few pages. I just read one piece of it, but there's pages upon pages there. The connection here ultimately is that to create transformation of the midas, not just not just refinement, but transformation that he learned is going to be similar to what we're talking now, to transform the gvuras from within, to transform existence from within, the ein oid. That's ultimately the common denominator.
You've been mentioning Rabbi Jackson the whole time, his Malchus and Torah, structure, his Malchus. In Or itself, in Chesed, you were saying it's a unified flow, it's a flow. But I remember that there's a Malchus, I think, of whether Chesed is Oros B'Shitas or Hiskalos. And I was just wondering that
say again, there's a what? I didn't understand that last.
That Or is
whether it's Oros Pshutim or Oros
right.
Mitsuyarim?
Yes. And
I
was wondering, there is structure. Isn't there structure and division in Or itself also? Not just in Chesed itself, without having to go into Gevurah, to the structure of Gevurah, into the Kalim. Meaning that Kalim, my eye, my neshama gives koach to all my evarim. But when it goes into my eye, the eye is a keli that is uniquely produces sight. But is the Or that goes into these different kelim, these different evarim, is that koach? Is that also differentiated? There's a certain differentiation that occurs within the light, within the neshama, within the Or, that only needs that also be differentiated to go into the specific kelim, or it's clear. It's simply just the power of the keli itself, the unique structure of Gevurah, the keli, that will the power, the koach is the same whether it goes into my heart or to my limbs or to my eyes or to my ears, but in the kelim completely differentiate it and enable it, or is there within the Or itself that goes into these different things? Is that uniquely defined also for that specific kelim?
Okay, that's the question of the two opinions of the energies going into whether the energy has particles already beforehand, or is it completely shaped by the containers? Like the example of a colorless liquid in tinted glass, right? So
Right.
There, the tint comes only from the glass. There's nothing. The water or the liquid is colorless, right? That would be an example of that one opinion. Another opinion is that there's already some tint, even if it's not discernible in the liquid, right?
Yes, that's what I'm asking.
So it's a good question because both of those opinions are in Ur. We're talking here Kalim, but at the end of the day, I will just say this, and I was going to talk about this, but later, because I don't want to confuse matters. At the end of the day, because we want to have a total fusion and harmony between godliness and existence, remember, Ur represents more godly energy. Kalim represent more structure of existence. But now we're learning that Kalim in their root actually represent a godly power that's even higher than Ur. So you see how everything turned around. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that Ur has still divine, it's like saying Ur Ein Sof. No one's ever going to dismiss Ur Ein Sof. Even if it does, but Chassidus goes so deep that it goes to places that are even higher than Ur. So at the end of the day, what the beautiful eloquence of this is, literally poetic, is that just as the Kalim have the structure part and the root in the Keach HaGvul, in the Helam Atzmi, ultimately, Rishimu Helam Atzmi, same thing, Ur is also going to have within it both elements of pshittus, of shapelessness, and elements of structure. And that structure is coming from the Gvuras of Atik that give it that structure. So the two opinions can be explained in that way as well. Remember, at the end of the day, the two opinions, according to Chassidus, are just two dimensions in Ur. It's reconciled. It's Pnimius Hakav, Chitzenius Hakav. It's different ways you can explain. So at the end of the day, all levels are necessary. You need a level of Ur. Like I many times said, there the focus is God sanctified us and give us mitzvahs. That's all inclusive. Then la'niach tefillin, ala tifas talis, lahadlik ner Shabbos is the specific. So which is the focus? On the Ur klali or on the Ur prati? On, like you put it, on the energy or on the particular aver or limb and organ? And the answer is we need both. And That's all part of the bigger picture. So you're touching upon something that gets into the whole full understanding of the Achdus, that Eretz and Kalim join, and Eretz has in its structure and also no structure. Kalim have structure and no structure, like we just learned. It's a Medida, but not a Medida Atzmis. So if Kalim Lamata is a Medida Mamish, Eretz Lamata is more or less Medida. You go higher up, Kali becomes less Medida because it's Medida Atzmis, and Eretz becomes more Medida because it's God's choosing to define a real definition. So a lot of things seem to be contradictory, but when you really start developing it, you see they all really come together in a very beautiful way. I'm definitely going to talk about this. I just don't want to go into it now because the plot is just developing. I'm trying to just lay out the facts, and then we can come back and connect it all. But this is a lot of processing that we're dealing with now, not so much absorbing the new ideas he's sharing here. But since you brought it up at the end of the class, I said, okay, let me go for it. I hope that was helpful.
Very helpful. Sort of like the Yud and Aver of the Rishima.
Exactly.
The Yud is included.
Perfectly correct. Just like there's the Oyer with the Keli within the Oyer, there's the Oyer in the Keli. Exactly right. So even though at the end of the day, there is an Oyer and a Keli, but the Oyer has Keli in it and the Keli has Oyer in it, you have to keep in mind that God's unity, like today science is discovering that even in the smallest detail, you have everything. It's just a question of microcosm, macrocosm. You know, like everything is like a hologram, like a seed. It has it all in it, but it's concentrated. But then we want to also have a structure. So I'll get into this. We need more time to develop it. Right now, I'm going to stop here. We're in the middle of what page did I just finish here? So we didn't make a lot of progress in space, but we moved along. Page 1338. And tomorrow I'm going to go over this in more detail. I want to read it inside. I'll try to post it as well. Yeah.